So, why am I on the floor? This is the only place that I could get a half decent angle so you could see this. My friend Eric told me after my last rant that I should be filming something or taking my photos on a Game Boy camera. I don't own a Game Boy camera, and I refuse to pay exorbitant amounts of money to get one because I don't think I'm going to get that much use out of it. But I do have a 2DS, so I'm going to film this pseudo intro on a 2DS just to tell him that, hey man, don't ever tell me to do something because I will do it. Don't you ever throw the gauntlet down at me. And also, here's the actual video now. If you bought a camera that doesn't have a meter or a non-functioning meter, or if you've had a camera for a while and you just want to get a few more ideas about exposing manually, today's Street Smarts is for you. So, have you heard about Sunny 16? So Sunny 16 is like a little mnemonic device that you use to figure out your exposure. Now, it's not perfect. It's really more of like a rough indicator, and it's something that I learned when I bought my first manual film cameras. So I bought 2 film cameras in Spain off a guy on the beach in a market for about 10 euros each, and they didn't have built-in meters. You know, one was a Voigtlander Vito B, and one was a Kodak Retina 2F or 3F, I think. But anyway, they were both nice lenses. They were nice cameras, and they worked. They were fully mechanical. So I just popped in some film and then realized, how am I going to take these pictures? Thankfully, it was the summer and Spain was very bright and sunny. So I learned about Sunny 16. Sunny 16 is a little device that you use to, like a mnemonic device that you use to remember how to expose in sunlight. So if it's a bright sunny day, you can shoot at f16 with your shutter speed set to 1 over your ISO. So if you're shooting ISO 100, that's 1 over 100. If you're shooting ISO 200 film, that's 1 over 200, and so on and so forth. And so, you know, that's just how it works. But that's just the baseline, right? And we're going to talk about that mnemonic device and manual exposure and exposure math because it's something that's very useful for you to learn. And while a lot of people might be aware of it, maybe there's some facets of it that need a little bit more of an in-depth explanation, especially if you don't know anything about it. Hopefully I can teach you something. And while math may sound daunting, really the math to do with photography and exposure is usually just doubling and halving. So you're not going to have too much of a difficult time, I don't think. So we're going to try to learn about that in today's Street Smarts. First, let's look at this little thing. This is the Film's Not Dead FND Pocket Meter. Yeah, it's a piece of paper that's got Sunny 16 and a few variations written on it, which is great. You know, like it's got shutter speeds for, you know, it's got sunny, shade, or overcast, or bright sun, hazy sun, and all of these little triangles that go in. It's something I picked up a few years ago in England when I was buying film and looking around at film cameras. So it's a fun little thing. It stays in my wallet. I don't really need to use it anymore too much because I know most of this, but it's a nice little fun little thing that I want to show off. Anyway, back to it. So exposure math. You probably have heard about the exposure triangle, which is, you know, your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. So the shutter speed dictates how long the camera shutter stays open. The aperture dictates the size of the hole in the lens that the light goes through, and the ISO dictates the sensitivity of the sensor, whether that be film or a digital sensor. I know technically it's ISO, okay, I know that, but I'm so used to saying ISO that I'm just going to continue saying it. But, you know, if you want to be completely accurate, it's ISO. So the unit for exposure is called a stop, okay? Now, a stop of light means the amount that you have either gets doubled or halved. So it's one amount of light. And so if you want to go up a stop, you double the amount of light. And if you want to go down a stop, you halve the amount of light. And so to do that, we're going to look at that for each facet of the exposure triangle. The easiest one is the ISO. because with the ISO, you just follow it normally. So if you have ISO 100 and you want to double the amount of light, you go to ISO 200. And if you want to have the amount of light, you go to ISO 50. And so that's why you have that. And it's really pretty straightforward, right? You know, from 400, you go down to 200 or up to 800. Pretty straightforward. And with shutter, it's similar, but remember, shutter speed is a reciprocal, so it's 1 over something most of the time. Like obviously you can shoot in 1 second, 2 second times, but 1 over 100th of a second is twice as fast as 1 over 50th of a second. So that's why you have to go up in shutter speed to like up in the reciprocal to go have the light. So if you're shooting at 1 over 100 and you want to double the amount of light, you have to go to 1 over 50, because realistically it's a fraction. So the bottom needs to go needs to be, well, when you multiply 1 over 100 into 2, you're going to get 1 over 50. But that's basically what I'm trying to say. Anyway, so if you want to go down a stop, you want to get half the light, you go to 1 over 200. And that's basically what's happening. But it gets a little bit more iffy with your aperture or your f-stop, right? So the aperture is a little bit different, because aperture numbers are something you're going to have to kind of remember, because they don't follow a very intuitive, or at least directly intuitive and easy to digest set of numbers. It's not just doubling and halving. There's a formula to them. I think the formula is like 1 over root 2 or something. But essentially, like say you're at f2.8, the next aperture, like one stop up is f4, and then 5, 6, and then 8, 11, 16, 22. And down is like f2, f1.4, and so on and so forth. There's really not much to learn beyond 1.4. I'm just going to show you this now, but I'll put it on the screen. I'll put a little link to it in the description so you can see that this is a graph from Outdoor Photography School. But yeah, so there's the F numbers you just sort of have to get used to remembering, but it's not too bad. F2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22. So now that we know about these stops, we're going to apply that to Sunny 16, and we're going to see how we can use that to our advantage. So for our basic understanding, we're going to say that our example is ISO 100, 1 over 100, f16 on a bright sunny day. Okay, cool. Now you want to say you want to move into the shade, and you just want to get an extra stop of light. So in the shade, you're probably only looking at 1 to 2 fewer stops of light compared to the bright sunlight. So you're just going to have to overexpose by a stop or 2. So one stop from f16 is f11. You can keep shooting the same exact settings, just take your aperture down to f11 and you're done. But say you have a situation where you're looking at, say, 4 stops fewer. Like you've gone indoors, you're looking at something like 4 stops fewer than you had outside. Then you want to start, let's say you want to go down from f16. Okay, cool. f16 to f11, that's 1 stop. f11 to f8, that's 2 stops. We've gone from f16. And then 5, 6, 3 stops, and then 4. So you can shoot 1 over 100 at f4 with the same ISO, and you don't have to change anything else. But say you wanted like a deeper focus. Say you want to do like f8 at most. So there's 2 stops that you've gone down from f16, but there's still 2 stops you have to compensate for. So you can take that and you can translate that to your shutter. So instead of shooting 1/100th, you want to shoot at 150th is 1 stop, and then 125th, that's 2 stops. And there you go. Now you've got the same exposure, like you've got the correct exposure, you've just got it indoors, and you can manipulate either the shutter speed or the aperture when you're shooting film. But if you're shooting digital, you can also manipulate the ISO. So, in these ways, we can learn to control our exposure and what it means to go up and down. And sometimes you're taking a picture and your camera is going to tell you, like if you have a camera with a meter, it's going to tell you what the correct exposure is, or it's going to tell you what it thinks the right exposure is. But that exposure is kind of like it's a game where you're trying to get to a certain number, and you can get to that certain number many different ways. Like say for 5, can be made like 2 plus 3 plus 0, or 2 plus 2 plus 1, or 2 plus, or 1 plus 1 plus 3, or something like that. Like there's lots of different things. You could do like 5 minus 2 plus 2, right? And you can get to 5. So that's basically all that is you have all these things that you can combine to get to that perfect exposure. But also the camera is metering in a certain way, right? It's looking at the whole scene or a spot of the scene depending on how you've based it. But sometimes you don't really want that or anything like that. You just want to fix something. You want to fix like your shutter speed. You want it to be really fast. You can take the reading that your camera is giving you and you can change it slightly using things like exposure compensation or by just manually dialing in your settings. And it's nice to learn that manual exposure because you'll also learn about what these things do, like how your shutter speed freezes motion, or your aperture affects your depth of field, and your ISO affects your ability to shoot something with a higher dynamic range when you're editing or stuff like that, or the grain if you're shooting film. So it's good to learn all of these things, and it's also nice to know how you can manipulate them effectively to get back to exposure. Usually you're not actually looking at full stops every time. Sometimes you're looking at third stops too, but full stops are a lot easier to digest, so that's why we're going to talk about it in full stops. But with a lot of lenses that are more modern and a lot of like cameras that have more shutter speed settings, you have more granularity in how much you can change the exposure. It doesn't have to go up an entire stop or down an entire stop. It can go up or down a little bit, so it's that's really sort of it. Yeah, that's the big street smarts this week. It's not too crazy, but it's got a lot of very useful, important information. It's stuff that you probably don't need to think about most of the time if you're shooting auto on your camera. But if you ever find yourself in a situation where you can't do that, or you need to override the auto settings, this hopefully will help you. Quick interjection before I sign off about the rules in photography and technical skills. Like the rules in photography are sort of like rules you learn so you can forget them. And the technical skills, while nice to learn and good to have in your back pocket, do you need them to make a good picture? At the end of the day, no. But again, they just serve the purpose of making it easier for you to get a good picture if you know what you're trying to get. But at the same time, you can just fall into a good picture. A good picture is just, being there, picking up the camera and taking the shot. You don't have to mess around with these settings, but when you know how to mess around with them, you can show up to places and be better prepared. And that's all really. At the end of the day, like the Sunny 16 isn't a rule. It's just a guideline to help you get a rough idea of exposure. It's not perfect, but it's something that helps, and it's pretty easy to remember. So something that I thought we'd talk about, but really I just want to talk about exposure and stops, because you might be able to pick up a camera today for next to nothing if it doesn't have a meter in it. And that might cripple you. You might have to use like an app on your phone. And while that works, sometimes it's just nice to be able to learn something so that you don't have to think about it ever again. It's just something like that. I still use meters even though I know these rules in my head. It's just that I use the meters so that I don't have to worry about them. It's like knowing how to do math but also owning a calculator. It's like I don't need to use this knowledge, but having this knowledge means that if for some reason the tools that I use get taken away from me, I can still do the thing that I need to do. So it's great for that. That's all. And I'll see you in the next one. If you have any suggestions on something you'd like to learn, this one is kind of like it's more beginner, but also applies to a lot of people, because a lot of people will continue to just use cameras and maybe not learn about everything or learn about these things like Sunny 16. It's not necessary, sure, but again, like I said, nice to know sort of thing. So yeah, if there's something you want to learn about that I may or may not know about, I will either, if I do know about it, great. If I don't, I will try to find out about it so I can make another Street Smarts. But yeah, let me know, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.